Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the National Conference of State Legislatures Energy Program webinar, a cost-benefit look at renewable energy standards. My name is Glenn Anderson. I am the Director of NCSL's Energy Program, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We will have some special guests today, the representatives from the Renewable Energy Laboratory, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory will be presenting on information they have gathered, basically cost and benefit data from various renewable energy programs across the U.S., and they will be presenting their findings, which are the basis for an upcoming report. And just a few things to keep in mind during the presentation. We will be hosting a question and answer session after our presenters are finished today. So we welcome your questions, and you can enter them at any time on the right-hand side of the screen in the chat box or in the question box. And so we welcome your questions and hope you will feel free to ask anything you would like of our presenters. I also want to mention that our webinar and presentation slides will be recorded and posted at the NCSL website following the release of the report. So basically the information that our presenters will be providing us today is not quite ready to be released, so there could be a week or two before the report is actually authorized for release, and at that time we will also post the slides and the recording. So at this point, I will introduce our speakers. We are very fortunate to be joined by Galen Barbos from the National Berkeley Laboratory and Jenny Heater from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Jenny Heater is a renewable energy analyst at NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. She focuses her research on SREC and REC markets, basically renewable energy credit markets, renewable portfolio standard policies, voluntary renewable energy market, and issues related to high penetrations of renewable energy on the grid. Prior to joining NREL, she worked for the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, representing ratepayer interests in renewable energy and energy efficiency cases brought by the utilities before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. Galen Barbos, who will also be presenting with Jenny, is a research scientist in electricity markets and policy group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Galen has worked at the lab for 12 years conducting analysis and providing technical assistance to policymakers on issues in the electric industry related to renewable energy, energy efficiency, regional electric system planning. As part of these efforts, Galen and his colleagues track and analyze state-level renewable portfolio standards and regularly brief policymakers and other industry stakeholders on the design and impact of these policies. So we will be starting, first off, with Jenny Heater.
Sorry, can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to thank NCSL for hosting us today and just provide a brief overview of the presentation. First off, I wanted to start with some highlights of the report, then move on to some methods of determining cost impact. So this section will look at different methodologies that have been used by utilities and states to assess incremental RPS costs. For this middle section, section 3, I will turn over to Galen, looking in depth at the actual data that we've collected and assembled in order to get a better sense of where incremental cost estimates are today. And then finally, we'll look at research that has been done on the benefits of RPS, and we'll conclude with some time for questions. So you can move on to the next slide. So just for a little bit of background, as you all are probably aware, we've seen increasing interest in RPS policies in recent years, whether that's modifying the resources that are eligible to meet RPSs or increasing the targets. There's been increasing attention paid to these policies. And we're at a stage now where there's really sufficient experience with implementing RPSs to begin doing some evaluation of how the policies have been working. So given all of that background, we began conducting this work looking at the estimates that have been done by utilities, states, and others to assess incremental costs as well as benefits of RPS policies. And just as a sort of preview for the rest of the presentation, this slide highlights some of our main conclusions. The first point is that RPS costs can be considered in the context of policy benefits, but what we found is that because of the methodological differences and a lack of benefits estimates, we're really not able right now to compare the current benefits and costs to each other. So the differences in the utility cost methodologies and assumptions are leading some states to investigate how to standardize those methods. And as I'll talk about later, there are a number of states at their PUCs are looking at that issue. In terms of the estimated RPS compliance costs, what we found from 2010 to 2012 was that those costs are equivalent to less than 1% of retail electricity rates when calculated as a weighted average, or about 1.2% when calculated as a simple average. And Galen will go into more detail on those figures. Looking forward, one of the questions that often comes up is, how much will these costs increase in the future? We do know that compliance costs in the future are limited in nearly every state by cost containment mechanisms. Moving to the benefits side, a number of states have developed quantitative benefits estimates, but we found that those vary both widely in the methods that are used as well as the magnitude. And just for a conclusion on the benefits side, folks have looked at avoided emissions, economic development, and price suppression. We found that those benefits range quite a bit, from about $5 to $25 per megawatt hour of renewable energy per benefit. I can move on to the next slide. So this section, I'll talk about some of the different cost methodologies used. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, first of all, I wanted to clarify what we're talking about when we talk about RPS costs. You can define RPS costs either as gross costs or incremental costs. Most states that we looked at use an incremental cost calculation, and that refers to the cost of renewable electricity above and beyond what would have happened absent an RPS. So presumably there would be some other type of generation that would have been procured, and the incremental cost looks at just that difference. When we look at studies done by utilities and regulatory bodies, we find that the regulatory structure of the state often determines how that cost estimate is made. So for traditionally regulated states, we find that utilities and PUCs are using a variety of methods. I'll highlight a couple here, and then on the next slide also look at where these methods are being used. But one common method is the proxy generator. So looking at the cost of the generator that might have been operating if the renewables were not online. Second method is looking at market price, so comparing the costs to purchase wholesale power. The third approach is using a modeling tool that helps understand what resources would have been dispatched over what time frame with and without renewables. And then finally, some states and utilities are using hybrid approaches, so a combination of of the methods I just mentioned. And then in restructured markets, we've seen costs not generally calculated by the states or load-serving entities for the most part, but we calculate compliance costs based on available REC prices, compliance information, and where possible, long-term contracting information. Next slide. So when we look around the country, this map highlights the methods that are used to evaluate or estimate incremental RPS costs. You'll see in the red, those are states in restructured markets, and in those states we're using a REC price methodology that I just described. In the traditionally regulated states, the states with the R's on them, we do see a variety of methods being used. And just for a few examples, in Oregon they use a incremental cost of compliance based on a combined cycle gas turbine proxy. In Washington, they look at the wholesale market prices, and utilities there have done that slightly differently. In Colorado, they use scenario analysis through modeling. They model basically what would happen with the RPS renewables and then what would happen without them. And then in Michigan, they use a hybrid approach. So renewables have both an avoided energy cost and an avoided capacity cost. And the avoided energy costs are based on either projected market prices or modeling, and the avoided capacity costs are based on a combustion turbine proxy generator. Next slide. So when we look at these different reports that have been done, there are a variety of factors that influence the cost calculation, and this will be provided in more detail in the report, but I wanted to highlight some of these issues that can impact the ultimate outcome of the cost estimate. So the first item here is the treatment of pre-RPS renewable generation. So we know some states with RPSs do allow pre-RPS generation to qualify for the RPS, but states have different ways of treating those resources when they do their cost calculations. So some of them really treat those pre-RPS resources as something that would have been installed anyway, and therefore say it's a zero cost. Or others, say that there still is a cost to that resource, so they factor that in. The second factor is the treatment of indirect expenditures. So these are things like integration costs or even administrative costs. And we found that some of these expenditures are hard to calculate, so it may be unclear whether a certain indirect expenditure is really due to the RPS or not. So that can be challenging. It can also be unclear what the, for example, administrative costs would have been to procure non-RPS renewables if there were no RPS. The third point here is looking at time frame issues. So there are two areas where this comes up. The first is the plant lifetime that's considered. In some cases, you may have a renewable generator that has a 20 or 25-year lifetime in a coal plant that has a 50-year lifetime. So there are differences in time frame that come up. The second time frame issue is really looking at how costs are assessed over time. So in some states, they'll look at the incremental RPS costs, say for 10 years, and then average that for each year. Whereas in other states, they are focused on what the actual expenditures were in each given year, even though those costs may vary significantly year to year. The next issue is the inclusion of a carbon adder. So in states where there's not a carbon policy currently, some utilities and states are still adding in a carbon cost to their non-renewable resources. And that's a decision that has been made in some states to really reflect the fact that there may be a carbon adder in the future, or that that state may prefer renewable resources from a carbon approach. And then finally, this is not necessarily a factor related to regulated states, but in restructured markets, I just wanted to mention that the REC price approach doesn't necessarily match the incremental cost of renewable generation. We know, and Galen will talk about later, that REC prices can vary from state to state and in regional markets depending on the supply-demand balance in that region. So it's another factor to consider when looking at the estimates for restructured markets. Next slide. So finally, just on the methods piece, I wanted to conclude with some notes about states that are making steps towards standardizing their cost calculation methods. And I just highlighted a few here. I won't run through them all, but interestingly, Delaware is in the process of developing rules right now for how the cost should be calculated. Their staff just came out with a proposal that does actually allow for inclusion of some benefits calculation. And then Washington also is also in the middle of this process. They're taking a comprehensive look at their RPS, and as part of that, looking at how the cost calculation is done. They saw some variation in how utilities were doing this, and as a result are taking up that issue. So now I'm going to turn it over to Galen, but just as a reminder for folks who may have joined late, you can enter your questions in the box on the right side of your screen. So please go ahead and do that. We'll take questions at the end, and I'll turn it over to Galen right now.
All right, thanks, Jenny. So let's see, you can advance another slide here. So I'm going to run through some slides that summarize historical data on RPS compliance costs. Here we're focusing in particular on incremental costs over the 2010 through 2012 period. And we are really primarily focusing on the cost to utilities or to the load-serving entities more generally. Following the distinction that Jenny made, our approach and our data sources really differ quite fundamentally between restructured and regulated states. For restructured markets, we calculate the compliance costs ourselves based on REC and ACP, alternative compliance payment prices and volumes. And here our REC pricing data come from a number of different sources, but wherever possible, we try to use data that come directly from the PUCs and that identify the actual average price of RECs retired in each year. For the regulated states, where calculating incremental compliance costs requires some corresponding estimate of avoided costs, as Jenny was explaining, we didn't develop our own estimates. But rather what we're doing for those states is really just synthesizing estimates that utilities and PUCs have developed themselves following the various methodologies that Jenny outlined. For both sets of states, however, we present the incremental cost data in terms of two metrics. The first is dollars per megawatt hour of renewable energy. So this is basically the above market cost of each megawatt hour of renewable energy procured. And then the second incremental cost metric is the percentage of average retail rates. And so this metric essentially tells you what the rate impact of the RPS would be if the utility costs were fully and immediately passed through to retail rates. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start out focusing just on restructured states, and we'll then turn in a few slides to the regulated states. For restructured states, where again we're relying on REC prices, there are a few important caveats to keep in mind, which I'll just quickly mention. The first is that REC prices are volatile. And as Jenny was explaining, in the short run, these prices are primarily a function of supply and demand balance. And so the REC prices and by extension our estimates of RPS costs don't necessarily correspond well to sort of short-term trends in the underlying renewable technology costs. The second caveat is that REC prices in many markets have somewhat limited transparency. And so the data we're using, at least in some cases, may be a somewhat less than perfect proxy for what was actually paid for RECs in a given year. And then finally, by relying simply on REC and ACP costs, we're ignoring both certain RPS-related costs, such as those associated with integration, as well as some benefits that also accrue to the utility. And so both because of that issue and the previous one on REC price transparency, the compliance costs that I'll be presenting here really need to be viewed as kind of first-order estimates, so to speak. Next slide. So moving into the data, here we present incremental RPS costs in dollar per megawatt hour terms for the restructured states. You can obviously see quite a bit of variability here, both across states and across years. These trends are, of course, in large part a function of underlying REC pricing trends. And so, for example, over this 3-year time period, REC prices in the New England states were generally increasing from year to year as supplies in the region tightened. And so we see those trends mirrored in the calculated RPS compliance costs, which you can see also kind of rise from one year to the next for those New England states. The cost trends in this chart here are also partly a function of the mix of resources and resource tiers within each state's RPS. And so states where there are secondary RPS tiers, for example, for existing resources, where those secondary tiers make up a large fraction of the overall RPS requirements, the RPS costs in those states tend to be relatively low. And so Maine would be one example of that. And then conversely, those states that have relatively aggressive solar set-aside requirements, those tend to have somewhat higher RPS costs in the figure here. Next slide. So here we flip over to our other cost metric where we show compliance costs as a percentage of retail rates. Again, these numbers are something like a theoretical rate impact if the utility costs were fully and immediately passed through. And so here we see that compliance costs in most states and years were below 2% of average retail rates, in some cases well below, though again, lots of variation. The drivers for these trends include the same kinds of factors that I mentioned on the last slide, but in addition, they also importantly reflect differences in the RPS target levels themselves. And so this is why, for example, in most states you can see that the costs rose from one year to the next, in conjunction with the RPS targets, which were also generally increasing from one year to the next. Next slide. So here we disaggregate the cost data for these restructured states on a number of different dimensions. In the top we break the data out according to resource tier, standardize the terminology a bit across states, and classify resource tiers as being either a main tier, a secondary tier, or a solar or distributed generation set-aside. And so you can see here, as you might expect, that the main tier requirements constituted the bulk of overall compliance costs in most states. Though clearly there are some exceptions where either the secondary tier or the solar set-aside requirements constituted a large share. In the bottom figure, we break the data out into costs associated with REC purchases and costs associated with alternative compliance payments or penalties. And over this particular 3-year period, most of these states were able to fully meet their RPS targets with RECs without having to rely heavily on ACPs. And so consequently, the bulk of the compliance costs in these states were also associated with REC purchases, as we see. Next slide. So turning now to regulated states, as I mentioned, for these states, our approach consisted of synthesizing RPS cost estimates that have been published by utilities and state PUCs, typically within the context of annual compliance plans or compliance reports. And so we've taken those results, and kind of tried to piece them together and, where necessary, translated them into our common set of metrics for comparison. There are lots of limitations and caveats here, which we've listed. I won't go through each one, but I will just highlight the third item in that list, and that's that there obviously is, as Jenny noted, quite a bit of variation from state to state and from utility to utility in terms of the methods and the assumptions that are used to estimate RPS costs. We do try to note, at least within the report, where those methodological differences seem to be most significant. But in the end, one does need to be careful here about investing too much significance in the fact that the cost numbers for one state are larger or smaller than another. Really, in the end, I think it's more important just to kind of step back and look at the collection of states as a whole, rather than to spend too much time sort of comparing one to another and investing a lot of significance in that. Next slide. Looking at the incremental costs first in the dollar per megawatt hour terms, you can see first that there are relatively few states where we actually have this data. So there are only 6 of the maybe dozen or so regulated states in our sample that we include here. Among those 6 states, you can see that the average above market costs for RPS resources were generally at or below about $20 per megawatt hour, which is in the same general ballpark as what we saw in the regulated, in the restructured states. Of some note, you can see that the incremental costs in one state, Oregon, were negative. In other words, the RPS resources were determined by at least one of the utilities there to yield a net savings. Next slide. So here we see cost data for regulated states expressed as a percentage of retail rates. Looking at the figure on the left, you can see that the compliance costs in most of these dozen or so states were at or below 2% of average retail rates. For 3 of those states, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, the costs were somewhat higher. And that was at least partially attributable to costs associated with those states' solar or DG set-aside. And you can see clearly in the chart on the right-hand side where we kind of break out those costs into the portion attributable to the set-aside versus the portion attributable to the general RPS obligations. And part of the dynamic here is that these solar and DG set-aside costs are often somewhat front-loaded, where utilities are meeting those targets through rebate programs or other kinds of upfront cash incentives where there's some big cost in year 1, and they're in essence sort of purchasing a strip of RECs over the lifetime of those systems generation. The next slide. So thus far, we've omitted California from the comparison graphics, and that has largely just been because there hasn't been any published analysis of incremental RPS costs per se. Instead, the California PUC has put out a report with gross RPS procurement costs, and then 2 alternate estimates of the avoided costs. One of those avoided cost estimates is based on something called the market price referent, or MPR, which is essentially a proxy for the all-in price of a combined cycle natural gas plant. And then the other avoided cost estimate is based instead on historical wholesale electricity market prices. And so what we've done is we've taken that data and calculated ourselves the implied incremental compliance costs using each of those 2 avoided cost estimates. And that's what's shown in the table here. I mean, you can see very different results depending upon which avoided cost estimate is used. Using the MPR, you can see that the incremental RPS costs were actually found to be negative with a net savings equal to 3.6% of average retail rates, whereas using electricity market prices as the kind of counterfactual for avoided costs instead gives you a positive and relatively sizable incremental cost on the order of 6.5% of average retail rates. So If nothing else, this is certainly a clear indication of just how important these methodological choices are when utilities develop their RPS cost estimates. Next slide. This is just a bit of a detour, I suppose. Many states levy surcharges, many utilities levy surcharges on customers in order to recover their RPS costs. And so we can look at those surcharges in order to glean some information about what the costs are that customers themselves directly bear. And that's what's shown in the table here, where we've just summarized for the year 2012 the average monthly surcharge for residential customers of those utilities that actually have a surcharge. And you can see that, lots of variation here, usually on the order of a few dollars per month, on average about $2 per month across this set of utilities. Next slide. So returning from that detour, I'll just say a few things about where RPS costs might go from here. As something of a snapshot, the figure here shows historical cost data for the most recent year available in each state. Those are the green vertical bars. And then the figure also then shows the corresponding RPS target or procurement level in those years. And those are the open circles, which go along with the right-hand y-axis. And so this gives some loose sense for how well historical RPS costs do or don't correspond to the aggressiveness of the targets in these states. It also tees up the question of how RPS compliance costs might evolve going forward as the RPS targets are ratcheted up as the current policies require happen. And so as of today, RPS targets or procurement levels are equal to about 7% of retail sales on average across the set of states here. In looking out at the targets in the final year for each state, so maybe 10 years down the line from here, we're looking at roughly a threefold increase in RPS obligations on average. And so all else remaining constant, we'd of course expect RPS compliance costs to rise in tandem with those targets. Whether and to what extent that happens depends, of course, on a great many things. Whether renewable energy technology costs continue to decline, gas prices, federal policies, and then last but not least, it depends on the cost containment mechanisms that are built into many RPS policies. And so that's actually what I'll focus on the next and my last slide. So most RPS policies include some form of cost containment mechanism. These come in many shapes and sizes, and I won't really get into all those design details here, but what we've done is we've taken those varied cost containment mechanisms and have translated them into the equivalent maximum possible increase in average retail rates at the peak RPS target for each state. And so that's what the horizontal red bars in the figure represent. And looking at those numbers, you can see that for almost all of these states, the effective cost caps are below 10% of retail rates, and in most cases actually less than 5% of retail rates. We also show in the figure the historical cost data from the most recent year. That's actually the same information that we had in the last slide. And we include that just to give some sense for how much headroom each state has before it starts bumping up against its cost cap. Among those states that rely chiefly on an ACP as the cost containment mechanism, and those are grouped on the left-hand side, you can see there's generally a fairly sizable gap between current costs and the effective cost cap. Among the states on the right-hand side, though, the cost caps, as you can see, are considerably lower in general, and accordingly many of those states are already starting to approach or bump up against their respective cap. And so, at least within some handful of states, there certainly is some decent possibility that these cost caps may start to become binding as the targets rise going forward. So that's it for me. I'm going to hand it back to Jenny now, and then, of course, if folks have questions about this information, we're happy to try to answer them at the end of the talk.
Great, thanks, Galen. You can move on to the next slide. Great. So in this last section, we wanted to provide an overview of the estimates of RPS benefits. Potential societal benefits include a number of different things, including reduced air emissions, health benefits, fuel diversity, electricity price stability, energy security, and economic development. And importantly, avoided costs of conventional generation are typically included in cost estimates, so we don't address those here directly. But what we did for this paper was review the existing literature on benefits estimates conducted specifically for state RPS policies. We did not include broader literature on renewable energy benefits, but we looked at studies that, for example, had been prepared for state legislatures or PUCs. And as you'll see, there were a variety of methods used to assess benefits impacts, and you'll also see that the level of analytical rigor varies quite a bit. Next slide. So this table here just provides a snapshot of the states that have done assessments of RPS benefits and the types of benefits that they identified. The three most common buckets of benefits we found were emission and health benefits, economic development impacts, and then wholesale market impacts. And as you'll see, these studies are typically required as part of legislation or done as part of an integrated resource planning process. Next slide. So the first category looks at emissions benefits. So this is things including SOx, NOx, and carbon dioxide benefits. So we found that there are really two main estimation methods. The most commonly used approach is actually modeling the electricity sector, which is done in most of the states listed here. Another approach is just looking at a displaced marginal generator emissions rate approach, which is a more simplified approach, and that was conducted in Maine. And the valuation is based on primarily the value of avoided emissions, but some studies also looked at the human health benefits from improved air quality. And some of the challenges in comparing these types of benefits to the incremental costs are that sometimes allowance prices, for example, for NOx or SOx, those may already be captured in wholesale electricity prices and incorporated into the estimates of incremental costs, as discussed in the last section. And then emissions benefits are often forward-looking rather than historical costs. And that's something that each study ranged in terms of the period of analysis and things like that. But overall, when we look at the limited number of studies that do assess emissions benefits, we found that they range typically from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis. When we look at that in terms of megawatt of renewable generation, the value was also quite a large range from $4 to $23 per megawatt hour. And when you dig into these assessments a little bit further, you find that often the value of carbon dioxide assumed in the studies really drives the magnitude of these emissions valuations. Next slide. So the second common benefit analyzed is looking at economic development impacts. And this can really be a range of things. A number of the studies look at job creation, either during construction or during the operating life of renewable generators. Can also include things like tax revenues or indirect and induced spending. Some studies also looked at changes in electricity prices and the economic impact of that. So there are different approaches also for looking at economic development impacts. commonly used are input-output models or case studies. It's done in Illinois, Maine, Michigan, and Oregon. 2 states also did economic modeling to assess economic impact. And one important consideration on the economic development side is really whether you're looking at net or gross impacts. So for example, if you're assessing the jobs that may have been induced by an RPS, it's important to consider whether those jobs are gross jobs created, so those jobs were due to the renewable generator, but if they're distinguished from net jobs, which would be if those jobs really were shifting from another resource. So when we look at these benefits overall, the one-time construction benefits really are on the order of hundreds of millions. Annual ongoing benefits over the project lifetime, we saw between tens and hundreds of millions. And again, when we convert this to dollars per megawatt of renewable generation, the benefits range from $5 to $27 per megawatt hour. Next slide. So this last benefit type is really looking at wholesale market price suppression. So the concept here is that renewable energy can depress wholesale market prices by displacing more expensive generators from the dispatch stack. So typically these assessments are done through dispatch modeling, looking at a scenario where renewable energy is implemented and where it's not, and comparing those 2 different scenarios. One cautionary note is that these effects may be captured in incremental cost estimates, so they may be embedded in the wholesale prices that are examined when looking at costs. But we did find that from the studies that have been done, the market price suppression was about 5 cents to $1.30 per megawatt hour when looking at the entire market. And when we convert that to looking at just the renewable impact, the benefit was equivalent to between $2 and $50 per megawatt hour, so also quite a range there as well. Next slide. So just to summarize the benefits section here, you've seen that there have been a limited number of studies that have identified RPS benefits and quantified them. The number of benefit studies done is really a lot more limited than has been done for RPS costs. The methods and rigor of analysis vary widely from states that are conducting modeling efforts to other states that are using more of a case study approach. And then finally, just to reiterate, it can be difficult to compare the benefits estimates to the cost estimates because some of those benefits may be already captured in incremental cost calculations. The time frames can differ. Only certain types of benefits may be assessed in the benefits calculations. And then we also have a timing issue of when the benefits may accrue versus when the costs are incurred. Next slide. And actually, you can just skip to the next one. So just to conclude here, wanted to provide an overview again of some of our main conclusions. We note that comparisons of estimated incremental RPS cost data are limited by the different methods that are employed. The cost estimates rely on available data. But using the last available year of compliance data, estimated incremental RPS costs are equivalent to less than 2% of retail rates in 17 states. And 10 of those states have costs equivalent to less than 1% of retail rates. The benefits estimates are really more limited. As I just mentioned, the methods and analytical rigor vary considerably, and comparing those costs and benefits can be challenging. In the future, we see that there's more work that could be done to comprehensively assess costs and benefits using similar methodologies and level of rigor. And as I mentioned in the methodology section, there is some ongoing work in states to standardize cost assessment. Some of that work may be relevant to other states that are at the beginning of this process. So the next slide is just the contact information for myself and Galen. Please do be in touch if we're not able to answer your question now or if you have questions in the future. But just wanted to conclude with that and turn it back over to NCSL to moderate questions.
Thank you, Jenny and Galen. It was a very, educational presentation, and we thank you for your research you're conducting in this area. So now we'd like to answer a few questions that we've had from our participants. And again, I want to remind folks that they can enter their questions on the right-hand side in the question box on their screen if they have any. So the first question we'll start with, we have a question about potential uniform, whether there's some uniform policies as it comes to, or when it comes to renewable portfolio standards. Obviously, they vary dramatically from state to state, but maybe there are similarities within the designs that may influence the costs of reaching specific targets or goals that you might be able to share. Either Galen or Jenny.
I guess I'll just say that, yeah, you're right that, each RPS policy is different, and no two policies are structured the same way, which can lead to some difficulties when comparing RPS policies across states. As Galen mentioned, there are some factors that may influence costs in terms of policy design. We did see that, states with a solar set-aside where they may be utilities may be offering an upfront rebate program have seen higher costs or seen that their costs may be driven by that policy component. On the flip side, some of the states with a large tier 2 or secondary tier have seen lower costs. So I don't know, Galen, if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a rich topic, and I think probably one could, write a report entirely, examining how differences in RPS design impact their costs and their effectiveness. Within this study, we didn't really have the ability to sort of dig deeply into those detailed design issues. I think the one that Jenny mentioned is probably the one area that we did look at most explicitly. Another area just off the top of my head is the extent to which states limit participation and eligibility from out-of-state generators. So many RPS programs have rules related to geographic location or the deliverability of generation into the state, and those provisions are often kind of predicated on policy objectives about local economic development and ensuring that kind of the benefits of the RPS are accruing to those people that are actually bearing the costs, namely ratepayers of within a given state. But at the same time, those sorts of restrictions on geographic eligibility and deliverability, they can often increase costs if a state is unable to sort of rely upon lower cost resources located elsewhere. I guess sort of part and parcel with that issue is questions about reliance on unbundled RECs. So that would be, I guess, another area that if we were to sort of do a deeper dive into those kinds of issues, that would be interesting to look at.
Sure, and I guess this is probably a question for Galen as well. The states that you covered, I know that there was data that was unavailable for some of them. This one was specifically, were there other states that are going to be discussed in the report that maybe you didn't indicate in your charts, such as Minnesota, or is it just the fact that the data is not available?
Yeah, so we included data in the report and in this presentation itself, we have data for all the states where data are available. So we tried to be as comprehensive as possible in terms of which states were included. Minnesota we actually do have in there, but only for a single year. Different states have different reporting requirements. I believe in Minnesota, the data we were relying upon was a report that was issued by the Public Service Commission, and I think they're kind of on a biannual cycle, perhaps, and so there might be another report that is coming due in the not-too-distant future.
And this one is more of kind of a comment, but maybe a question also for Jenny regarding the benefits and benefits research out there for health and monetary benefits. Question being, how accurate those might be, and the question of whether measuring these externalities does that really present an argument for the policy, or is there is this something that that utilities or consumers would know about in any event, just with regards to the justification for those benefits?
So yeah, the studies that we looked at were primarily done at the request of legislatures or PUCs in terms of an IRP process. And a lot of, the background for that is that, states are interested in having an RPS because of the benefits that they believe that RPS will bring. So the studies that have been done do vary, as I mentioned, quite a bit in the level of rigor that's been done. So some are using, detailed modeling approaches, while others are using more simplified approaches. So I will just say that, there's a variety of work being done in that space using different approaches, but it does help answer questions that legislators may have in terms of what benefits are accruing and what the magnitude of those benefits might be.
Okay, and there's a question about something called the stamp cost analysis as it relates to RPS, and whether that is a credible cost assessment and how it might differ with the other methodologies described in the presentation.
The stamp cost estimate, I guess I'm not familiar with that acronym.
Okay, that was a question, just STAMP. If not, we can go on to the next question here. With regards to stakeholder issues and concerns from stakeholders, what are some of their concerns and how that's incorporated into this work?
Do you mean questions from stakeholders about how costs should be assessed?
I believe so. It's a pretty general question, just asking to speak to the stakeholder issues and their concerns. And I believe it's probably about cost assessments and how those may vary among different stakeholders, whether it be utilities and also obviously ratepayers, and how they feel about these approaches.
I'll just, I guess, speak to the stakeholder input on different methodologies or considerations when states and utilities are assessing incremental costs. We have seen, in the states that are looking at standardized approaches, different stakeholders with different opinions about, the time frame that should be analyzed, or things like including a carbon adder or capacity evaluation and things like that. And those considerations are important policy considerations for the PUCs. They also do or can have an impact on what the ultimate cost assessment is that comes out from that utility or PUC assessment. So in some of these states, renewable advocates are getting involved. some of the trade associations, things like that, are getting involved in really outlining their position on what types of costs should be included, as well as the method for evaluating those costs.
Yeah,
and oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to that I mean, I think one of, and maybe this is sort of germane to the question, but that often when sort of different stakeholder groups engage in these issues about RPS costs, it can be really important, I think, to be clear about what the boundary of the analysis is. You know, which stakeholders are being included in the analysis itself. You know, costs and benefits to whom, because you know, depending upon what group you're looking at, they may have a very different sort of set of interests, and the costs and the benefits that are relevant to different groups may really differ. So, I mean, obviously, for many policymakers, they're interested in kind of the costs and benefits at a social level. You know, they want to understand costs and benefits for their constituents or for the state as a whole. Whereas, you know, a utility or a ratepayer advocacy group may have a somewhat narrower and more restrictive conception of costs and benefits. So I would say that often is a really kind of critical issue, and I would just, you know, for folks that are engaged in these topics, I think that's always one of these threshold things that needs to be clarified in order for the discussions to be productive.
We have a few more. I guess we have time for two more. I have two more questions here. One of them is a question about the carbon adder and its role in the incremental costs of calculations for the RPS.
Yeah, so in some states, we have seen that they have included a carbon adder. So what they'll do in those assessments of incremental costs is look at the costs for the renewables and then look at the costs for the non-renewables, but include in that non-renewable cost a carbon adder. So this was done in Colorado previously, and then a couple other states. With the sort of the understanding, at least in Colorado, some of the background was that, you know, there was an anticipation of a federal carbon policy coming down, and so they wanted to include those anticipated costs in the cost of the non-renewable generation. So that's really the method for doing that, and then, you know, what that actual value is can also be contentious. Sometimes, you know, utilities and states are coming up with different values for what the actual carbon value should be.
Just following up on that question, was that actually, do you know exactly how large a role that may have played in that calculation for Colorado, for instance?
You know, one of the challenges to this work is that because we are relying on the assessments that have been done, we don't have every, you know, scenario that they ran. We don't have that information. I don't recall if they ran a scenario without the carbon adder or not, but my recollection is that they did not. But that may be something that's available if that person wants to get in contact with me.
Great. And then one final question here. Have you found differences within states relative, well, I guess relating to the cost of compliance with the RPS and the size of the renewable energy credit generation facility? And I guess in a regulated state, that would be just the size of the renewable facility that is being used to meet the RPS.
So I guess if I understand the question, it's sort of getting at whether there maybe are economies of scale with larger facilities yielding lower costs. I'm not entirely sure, but I guess
I think that's what they're getting at. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you know, the data that we're using unfortunately doesn't really provide a whole lot of insight here because we're really working kind of with aggregate level information. You know, the total cost that a utility bore across its entire base of resources. So we don't necessarily have kind of, you know, resource by resource the incremental cost. But there are lots of information sources out there. LBL puts out an annual wind market data report and also an annual report on solar costs that show how resource costs vary by facility size, and so you can get some sense of economies of scale by looking at those documents.
Well, great. I actually had one quick question. I think from what we know and from a lot of what utilities are telling us that and regulators, that the amount of investment that is required just to keep our grid up to date, investments that are needed to upgrade the grid, there's a upward price trend that nearly every state will be seeing with regards to customer costs for electricity. And with that, those upward trends, whether a utility is building a, say, renewable or other type of energy generation, how do utilities go about calculating the cost of the RPS and possibly separating that out from other types of upward trends, and whether when they do that it's say compared to the cost of building something else versus just complying with the RPS?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just gets to the fundamental challenge, especially within regulated states, of estimating incremental RPS costs. It always requires that you stipulate some sort of counterfactual world where you say, okay, what would have happened in the absence of the RPS, what would have been built, and what would have been the cost of that, and then compare it to what actually happened. And so, I mean, I think, I'm not sure whether the fact that all of these other costs are increasing fundamentally changes that difficulty, but it certainly, I think, at least on the face of it, suggests that the answer, it makes the answer less clear on an a priori basis, and so it makes it more important to try to kind of get the, the numbers right. But I think, I mean, in short, the answer to the question is, there are a bunch of different methodologies that utilities have used that Jenny laid out, but they all have, advantages and disadvantages, both in terms of their accuracy, in terms of their transparency and simplicity, and so forth. And so I think there's unfortunately no sort of single nutshell answer to that question other than to just understand what the methodological options are and what the advantages and disadvantages are of each of them.
Well, thanks. Jenny, did you have any concluding comments?
Just on that last question, I will also note that, the focus of our study really was on historic RPS incremental cost estimates, but there have been a handful of studies that have looked forward to try and compare, what will the cost of RPS be compared to if we didn't have the RPS, and some of those studies do take into account some of the issues that you mentioned, Glenn. But, there are methodology issues on that side as well that Galen mentioned. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, great. Well, big thanks to both of you, Galen and Jenny, for sharing your expertise with us on today's webinar. And we also want to thank our attendees for logging in and participating. And we want to remind folks that we will have a recording of the webinar along with the presentations available for participants as soon as we find out when, or as soon as the report is released. And we'll also be sending out links to that report. I'll also note that we'll include a link to we have a fairly recently updated chart on state legislative activity on RPS. So you may be interested in that as well. So thanks again for joining the webinar, and we hope you will be able to attend our next energy program webinar.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.